and listeners who maybe weren't alive at the time talk about the how intense was that battle? What was public opinion at the time with regard to the vote in Congress on this legislation?
Well, I mean, much of what Rand Paul is arguing, that there needs to be the separation, was the conservative line at the time. It's not dramatically different. In fact, his argument that private business owners should be able to determine whom they want to serve was the standard argument throughout the Jim Crow time period for excluding African Americans. We don't remember the degree to which segregationists at the time were actually quite couched in their language. They were worried about legal challenges, so they were trying to position themselves really strategically so that they could make an argument. And so what is eerie about Rand Paul's argument in the past days, I see he's walked back from it, is that it echoes an earlier time period in really distinct ways, and the divisions that were there in 1964. And I think we also don't recall the degree to which this was controversial. We'll remember that this is the reason why the March on Washington was called, to put pressure on D.C. to pass a civil rights legislation that would really break this barrier of public accommodations, of being able to sit at lunch counters. The sit-in movement of 1960 sparks this really mass movement. The Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s also is talking about a similar dynamic. And so this is a central fight, a really basic fight for African Americans, sort of the front door of civil rights. And so for it to be complicated now is problematic.
I wanted to also bring in Mike Irvin, freelance journalist, longtime activist with the disability rights group ADAPT. He's in Chicago. Mike, this also deals with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Can you respond to Rand Paul, the new Kentucky Republican Senate nominee, and talk about how the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, got passed?
Sure. Well, first of all, the statement that he made was typical shallow Tea Party stuff, saying something like, if you have a two-floor business and you hire someone that uses a wheelchair like me, that the federal government would automatically come in and demand that you install a $100,000 elevator is ridiculous, because what the ADA says is that you have to make reasonable or programmatic accommodation. You don't have to go through an undue hardship. So the kind of solution that he came up with of giving somebody a first-floor office would be exactly the kind of thing that the ADA would say that you should do, and it would be within the law. So to go around making people think that the ADA is this big boogeyman that makes people, makes private businesses go through these huge changes, they're going to bankrupt them just to accommodate someone in a wheelchair like me, is either ill-informed or purposely misleading. And again, it sounds like typical Tea Party stuff to me. And the ADA, you know, it was signed in 1990, and the legislative history of it cited congressional hearings that cited pervasive discrimination in all walks of life against folks with disability, both in public and private facilities and programs. And it wasn't like we just decided one morning to pass this nice law. It was done because people like me ran into the same problems that we just heard about from your other guests, where we didn't know from day to day what we were going to run into, whether you'd be able to access public transit or whether you'd be able to get into a certain building, whether it be public or private. We had many of the same segregation and discrimination problems that we heard about. So it's a law that's very dear to us and has made a lot of real difference in our lives.
Can you talk specifically about how has your life changed in the last 20 years, Mike?
Sure. Well, for someone in the middle of a city like me, I mean, the first thing you could point to is transportation, both public and private. In 1992, we got our very first wheelchair-accessible bus in Chicago. Up until that point, I couldn't ride public transit at all. There were no taxi cabs that were wheelchair accessible in Chicago at the time. Now there are about 100 of them. I still can't get on all the public transit systems here in Chicago because some of them are old and haven't been made accessible yet under the ADA. And then, of course, there are court decisions, namely the one Olmstead decision that has said that states are violating the ADA when they lock people with disabilities up in institutions, and they could be accommodating them by giving them services in their homes. And that is a monumental decision. That's our Brown versus Board of Education.
And Mike, what about this issue that Rand Paul has tried to raise of the separation between outlawing discrimination in public institutions versus in private firms, the viewpoint that the less government, the better, and this is an intrusion of government into private individuals and private businesses?
Yeah, well, basically then what he's saying is that every private business has the right to say, we don't want you in here, get out of here. And we're getting back to the old lunch counter problem again. Yeah, I think that most people would disagree with him quite significantly on that. You know, that little steps, which are often all that is required, little steps should, no affirmative steps should have to be taken at all to make it possible for someone who uses a wheelchair or someone who uses a service animal. Should a person who owns a restaurant or a store be able to say to a blind person who needs a dog to get around, get out of here, no dogs allowed in my store or my restaurant, and thus tell the blind person they can't come in? Are those the kinds of things that he's talking about? Should a cab company that makes money operating in my city be able to say, we don't want to have any wheelchair accessible vehicles and we don't care if you get around just like everybody else? Is that really the kind of thing that he's talking about?
I want to turn to another issue, that of Rand Paul's former communications director, Christopher Hightower. He resigned in December after his MySpace page was found to have a post declaring Happy N-Word Day, but it used the full word, and showing a photo of a lynching around the time of the federal Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. The MySpace post was first reported by the Kentucky-based blog Barefoot and Progressive. Joe Sanka is the editor of the blog. He's joining us via Skype from Lexington, Kentucky. Joe, talk about what you discovered back. Was it in December that you broke this story?
Second.
Talk about what you exposed. Joe, we're trying to... Joe, we're just trying to... Hi, Joe. Tell us what you exposed in December. Well, we'll try to get Joe on the telephone so that he can explain what it is he exposed. But I want to go back to another clip.
Yes. Hello?
Hi, Joe. Can you hear us?